campers.
Hello again.
It's fun week.
And I hope you're having fun because we are.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to do some demoing today.
Yeah,
special techniques.
Shaking things up a little bit.
Maybe raise the bar a little bit in terms of some skills you'll learn if they're new to you.
And every week you're making individual choices. So the 3 little demos we're doing today may or may not apply to the blocks that you've chosen, but they're skills that we think are handy to have as a quilter that you may use this week, you may use them in a month or in a year.
But because it is an adult camp, it isn't like you have to eat some kind of mystery meat you don't want to eat at camp. As somebody was saying, the counselor made them drink tomato juice. If you don't want to do these blocks, you don't have to.
Absolutely fine.
Yes, but we think it's kind of fun. We think you might enjoy it. So,
as always, we'd like to show you kind of the general progress. This isn't all of the blocks, but you can see here the range of blocks that we've done for installment 3. And
there's a lot of blocks we're starting to
accumulate.
Put together, and you're going to be able to see again, as you did in the second installment, how the more blocks you make, the more that they go together. Or you might spot that there's a fabric that doesn't work, that you need to eliminate, or but the more you have, the more you'll see how well the colors are working together.
And as we say, if you liked your original palette, it's probably going to look great throughout the whole thing.
Absolutely.
And another thing you might notice as you look down is we have a couple of improvisational blocks that are always what we say, improvisation within structure.
Yeah.
And
it isn't mayhem.
No.
And it doesn't mean the craftsmanship doesn't matter, because craftsmanship matters. It always
matters to us.
But we have some techniques that if you haven't done improv before, will be like a little mini workshop for you.
Yeah. So we're going to do a couple here and one at the sewing machine. But why don't I start by walking people through a simple cutting. And we're going to be looking at this block. This is the mini golf block. So I'm going to move this aside. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And
this is like the one from installment 1.
Yeah, and this is something that was in installment 1, a slightly different variation. And it's something that we'll have variations of throughout this Quiltalong. So what you learn here, even if you don't do this block now, it'll probably apply to something else.
Can I also just jump in and
absolutely.
say, the other thing that this will do is, for those of you who aren't comfortable using, like maybe you're a new quilter, or you haven't used rulers in the way that Bill is about to show you today, I think you'll find that rulers, you don't need that many rulers, but you just need a couple of really good ones, because depending on how you use it in conjunction with your mat, they can be extremely versatile.
Mm-hmm. So you'll see that there are certain blocks that, actually, would you mind handing me one of the finished mini golf blocks? I'll take this guy right here. Thank you. So the finished block is slightly off kilter. It's rotated. And the easiest way to do this is actually to start with a slightly larger block, as the instructions have you do, and then rotate it and trim it down to the finished 5.5-inch square. So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to undo this for a moment. So we have this is our square up ruler, but you can do what I'm showing you with just a standard 6-inch cutting ruler. To trim this to 5.5 inches, there are people who own a whole set of different size squares. We don't.
Yeah,
we actually don't have a lot of notions in our studio.
Or rulers.
We have like 3 rulers that we love. We have a handful.
Designed.
Yeah, we happen. Yeah, so we should love them.
Yeah.
But in this case, we know that we have a 5.5-inch finished block. So this is some flexible vinyl that just sticks to anything. You can use this, or you can write with a Sharpie
or even tape.
Or just ordinary
tape.
like masking tape or painter's tape. And what I'm doing right here is I'm finding the 5.5-inch line on the inside in both directions, and I'm using this removable tape, or vinyl actually in this case, and it's so nice because you can easily move it. So that gives me a 5.5-inch square. So I know, and actually, would you mind handing me a Sharpie?
Yes.
We always have Sharpies around as well. And you don't need to do this next step, but it is something, thank you, that I like to do, but you don't need to do. So if you have a 5.5-inch square, I happen, if you think about half of 5.5, it's...
Before you
Yes.
do that, let me just explain that our rulers have the numbers printed on the underside, underneath the non-slip. If you have rulers that are printed on the top, you don't want to do this
because the Sharpie could ruin.
Yes. When you try to take the Sharpie off, your measurements might come off as well. So it just sort of depends on your ruler.
I just like, if I'm using this as a 5.5-inch square, I personally just like to mark where the center of that square is right away, because it's a little easier for me to see. So I'm looking at this and I know that right now it's, it looks odd because it looks off center from the big ruler, but you could either draw diagonals or you just know that it's 2 3/4 of an inch. And the reason I do that is I can just eyeball and pivot. And what I'm trying to do here is I am going to cut the 5.5-inch square. And this is where, if you've never done this, it can seem a little odd because you're like, how do I cut down there? And the way you do it is, you notice I'm looking at all the corners and they're all within the block.
They're all pink. You're not running off the edge.
Okay.
You're just going to do 2 sides at a time.
So, oh, sorry. There we go. I'm going to cut one side. I'm going to cut the other side.
And then you're going to close your blade.
I close my blade between every cut. It's just a habit for safety. Then what I'm doing is I'm rotating and I'm nesting that corner right in there and rotating. And I don't have to have the exact center on this, it's just good enough. Okay, there we go. Time for a new blade. And so what I have, and I actually slipped because I was cutting in a very awkward angle there. Let me just trim that off. And I have a nicely rotated block. And they don't have to be rotated the same amount. Everyone can be a little different. Yeah. But that is so much easier than cutting odd size shapes and trying to sew them on. And if you look, it's not very wasteful of fabric. There's just a little extra.
When you use this technique and you anchor it on 2 sides and then rotate it 180 degrees, you don't need a ruler for every single size that you might ever sew. You can just use the lines on there.
And if you're someone who has template plastic on hand, you could just cut a 5.5-inch square and just lay it right on top.
That works too.
Or even a piece of cardboard works. I mean, take a 5.5-inch square of cardboard, set it on top, and that's your cutting guide.
You just want to make sure that you know where the center of the block is, and maybe align that with the center of the cardboard. If you had
cardboard, you could draw an X to find the center, stick a pin through it, and do that, and then just kind of rotate it.
Exactly.
One of the things I like about quilting is there are 5 ways to do everything.
Absolutely.
And one of the great things about the Facebook group is every time someone has a question, quilters are generous.
There's so much expertise in that group. I mean, there's 6,700 people in that group, and not all of them most of them are not doing the Quiltalong, but they'll weigh in. A lot of them are, might have some other obligation, or they can't fit it in their schedule or whatever, but they are happy to share their expertise.
So that is the way that we trim these blocks. And there was one in the first installment. We didn't mention this but we realized, oh, this would be a good thing to talk about, especially since you'll be doing more of it. And now Weeks is going to go over the sewing machine to show you one of the improv blocks and some tips and techniques for that.
I'm going to be demoing the horseback riding block, and this may look like it's appliqued, but it's actually pieced, and it's an improvisationally pieced block. So one of the tips that I would suggest if you're using solids, because it can get a little confusing with the front side and back side once you start cutting, is to chalk a really thin line in the seam allowance for the bottom of the block, so you know what side is the front and what side is the top and bottom. I've already inserted these 3 strips in here. So I'm going to put the 4th strip in here, and I like to have the strips not all go in one direction, just kind of leaning a little bit left and right. So I'm going to center it meaning halfway, about halfway between. This isn't super exact, but make sure it's at least 1/4 of an inch away from the other strips. And I'm just going to cut. And then I'm going to take the strip, remembering that this is the bottom, and I'm going to align it with the raw edge. We've allowed a little extra length in here for you to trim things down, so don't worry too much about that. And if you saw one of our Facebook posts, we talked about having the smaller piece on top is often an easier way to sew. Okay. So now I'm going to press this and show you how I'm going to trim it down to sew it to the other side. Now that I've pressed this seam, I'll show you how to trim it down to make it easier to align it to the other side. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to align the edge of the ruler with the rest of the block, and I'm just going to cut straight to cut that little odd piece off, and I'm going to do that on both ends. Now this is a really odd angle, so this might, don't let this throw you. How you're not going to align the edges. It's kind of like a triangle where you're going to align. Do you see this point right here? 1/4 of an inch in, and they're not going to align because this is not a right angle. So what you want to do is make sure that you have they intersect at 1/4 of an inch right there. And on the other end, if you were to flip it over, it's so close you can barely see it, but you'll see on the other side, at the other end, it will also overlap a little bit at 1/4 of an inch. And I will pin it just so you can make sure that you understand how to keep that straight. And now we're going to sew that last seam, and the block will be finished. So here's the finished block, and you can see that blue strip that I put in there is flush at both ends and looks nice and crisp on the back as well. And don't worry if your ends aren't perfectly flush, because we did build in a little extra for you to be able to trim down. So you'll be trimming the whole block down to 5.5 by 5.5. What would fun week be without a roller coaster?
So we said early on that these blocks weren't literal, but I've got to admit that when we design them, we're always thinking roller coasters, up and down, up and down. So this one is kind of an over and under woven effect. This is an example of the finished block. And what's fun is your mind sees this red strip as going underneath the blues there, and then here it's going underneath the greens. For that to have kind of an effective look though, your craftsmanship has to be decent. You want to really end up with those nicely aligned. So we want to show you a little tip that can help. So what I've got, this is like a cooking show when I've got a block, thank you, in progress. And I've sewn 2 of the pairs, and the goal is to sew these all together. Now, the thing is, let's say this is not well aligned. You can see, obviously I'm exaggerating.
No, but even an 1/8 of an inch, you can see the difference when it's complete.
So the thing is, this visually wants to connect there. So what we tend to do is we take a chalk pencil, and we love the little clover. We use ordinary school board chalk all the time, but when we want a fine line, we actually find that this clover marking wheel is really nice and effective.
And it has a refill also,
that's true.
Which is nice.
And so what I'm doing, you can see here that it kind of continues the line across. And we might have
can I just, because you were talking while you were doing it.
Yes.
So, because you did it super fast, what you want to do is align the ruler with the bottom, with the seam, and make sure that you draw a line that extends it.
Here.
Because what you're trying to do is find the line where you're going, the exact point where you're going to pin, to make sure that you get that visual connection. So what you're trying to do is figure out what is the point where you're going to pin. You don't want to start, a lot of people start pinning at the bottom edge or the top edge, and it might stretch, or it might just get out of whack a little bit. So
I'm glad she said that.
I know
I was ahead in my mind.
You were going ahead.
So, but her point's really good. Usually people just kind of pin at the edge, and let's face it, it's fabric, things stretch a bit. And so generally working from the center out distributes any unevenness. And what I do here is I put a pin through this line, and I've pinned from the back, coming right through that line, and I pin 1/4 of an inch down from the edge. And this is going to be a little tricky to see. I take that pin and I put it right through the seam, also 1/4 of an inch down.
And this is where those seams pressed open makes it a
really
little bit
helps.
easier.
And I'm going to peek inside, and this can be a little tricky, but I'm peeking inside, and I'm going right through that chalk line, and then 1/4 of an inch right through that seam.
1/4 of an inch from the raw edge.
From the raw edge. And I could do the same thing with these others as well. But I've found, at least with this block, if you get the center one accurate,
with a small block,
with a small block, you can also pin the edges, I'd say.
But this concept and this extending the seam across sashing also helps you align blocks when it's in a grid and they're sashing. This concept is so invaluable.
Yeah, it's
for
really helpful
pieces,
when you have any grid or columns or rows
like
that
an
make the line.
expanse across, that you're trying to get 2 things lined up across some kind of expanse, large or small, and you want it to not look like it's just slightly shifted.
Yeah, and in fact, you recorded, you did a tutorial on YouTube, which we will link in that description, just on the left below the video.
It's an old video, but it's the exact same thing, and it's
Just
when you're
different
trying
scale.
to align blocks across sashing and rows.
And I'll be right back. I'm going to sew these together, and I'm back. And you can see here how those chalk lines helped us align perfectly. And because that was aligned from the center, these others across the fuchsia also look very aligned. And then I could do the same thing chalking across the green to put the last one on. You may find that the blocks are so small that you don't need to do this. It's totally individual. If you feel that things are shifting, this is a great trick. And it's especially useful when things get even larger. But, you know, it's a tip we thought we should absolutely share because we do it very frequently.
Well, and also we have some some new quilters who are making their first quilt in the Quiltalong.
Which is very impressive, by the way.
So we want to make sure that they have all the tools that they need to be successful.
Yeah. So we hope these 3 tips, combined with the fun that happened this week, it will keep you going, keep you energized for yet another week of summer camp.
Have fun.
Bye-bye.